Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, as mentioned, I'm from the School of Veterinary Sciences at the University of Bristol, and at the University of Bristol we have a cross-faculty institution or institute, the Cabot Institute, named after the famous explorer who set sail from Bristol in the late part of the 15th century to discover the New World, etc., well, following the footsteps of Columbus. This institute basically deals with global uncertainty, including matters of food security. And we now have, as the chair of the external advisory board of this Cabot Institute, John Beddington, who was previously the government chief scientist, and he wrote a very well-known report on the future of food and farming, where he talked about a lot of the problems facing mankind and feeding themselves, population growth, climate change, the need to feed an ever-increasing population, and referred to the perfect storm of global events. And I think these are the sort of challenges that our Cabot Institute was put together to face, bringing together people from faculties across the university. I also, to some extent, represent something called the Food Security and Land Research Alliance, which brings together the University of Bath, Bristol, Cardiff, Exeter, and Rothamsted Research, as well as Duchy College, and one or two other players waiting in the wings to join, to provide a really coordinated, strong grouping in the field of food security and agriculture amongst the various academic institutions in the southwest of England. And I'm now privileged to be a co-director of this FSLRA, along with Michael Winter from the University of Exeter. So I want to sort of set the scene, really, this afternoon, thinking about challenges that we face as a planet and as humanity. And we'll start with population, which is perhaps one of the biggest and most concerning issues. So Hans Rosling of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden has compared the human population across the planet almost to a kind of global pin code. So roughly speaking, he talks about the population of the planet in billions in the Americas, in Europe, in Africa, and Asia. And interestingly, if you were to steal the planet's bank card, it would be useful to know that the PIN code is 1114 currently, about 7 billion people in the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia, respectively. Now, there are a lot of different figures about the prediction for the human population. It's widely cited that the population will be somewhere in the region of 9 billion by 2050. Hans Rosling actually believes that the human population will stabilize at some point beyond 2050 at around the 11 billion mark, with a new PIN code of 1145. So essentially the number of people in the Americas and Europe, in his vision, are not likely to change that much. The biggest increase will be mainly in Africa, where the population is set to increase fourfold, and there will be another increase of about 1 billion people in Asia. So in terms of the big sustainability debate, I think it's always worth having in the back of your mind this point that actually the biggest increases in population are not going to be evenly distributed across the planet. They're going to be largely in Africa, which relatively speaking is an underpopulated continent compared to the others, and to some extent in Asia. Well, where do things stand at the moment? Well, it's been suggested that to maintain our present level of consumption at this present time, we would need an additional half a planet. So we're actually currently half a planet short to maintain our present consumption levels. And were everybody on the planet, just present numbers of people, to consume at the rate enjoyed by people in the United States of America, and many people would aspire to that level of consumption, we're going to need somewhere between 4.5 to 5 additional planets to actually sustain ourselves. Now, in the absence of extra planets anywhere, we're going to have to think about other ways to prevent collapse of global civilization. So Lupo has already mentioned the seminal report, Livestock's Long Shadow, principal author Henning Steinfeld from FAO, that basically points out many of the environmental problems associated globally with livestock keeping, and famously that something like 14.5% of all anthropogenic, man-made greenhouse gas emissions are derived from livestock, and of that, a very large fraction from ruminants. This has actually been superseded, I was going to say last year, I need to say a couple of years ago now, by a follow-up report that is a little bit less bleak, a little bit more sort of forward-thinking and optimistic, more about solutions as well as problems, tackling climate change through livestock. But nevertheless, these enormous emissions from livestock, and particularly beef cattle and milk production, are sort of headline items here. So this is obviously highly relevant to the title of the talk and many of the issues that people here are concerned with. I was fortunate enough to meet and talk with Henning Steinfeld in November, in fact, at the 40th anniversary of the International Livestock Research Institute at one of its two main headquarters in Addis Ababa. And Henning actually, in a summing up session at the end of this conference, suggested that by 2050, beef will no longer be on the menu except as a luxury item for the wealthy few. So I think that is an interesting thought. It's perhaps one not shared by everybody, but he is certainly a leading expert in the field, and it's worth bearing in mind that's his view. Well, he's not alone in this view. So I'm sure many people are familiar with the fact that the climate change report lead Lord Stern, who persuaded our government to take climate change seriously, suggested that we need to give up meat to save the planet, and headlined this in the Times newspaper. And our newspapers do from time to time remind us of the dangers of eating meat. So, for example, in The Observer, I think this was in around 2008, the United Nations says eat less meat to curb global warming. And again, more recently, I think this was around 2013, we were told in The Guardian that we should eat less meat for greater food security. In 2013 again, Tony Weiss, writing in the Journal of Peasant Studies, actually almost put together a hypothesis that there's a kind of global conspiracy around the production of grain and oil and livestock, and that rising meat consumption and industrial livestock production should be understood together to comprise a powerful long-term vector of global inequality. And then last year, a much talked about publication in the American Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals, Gideon Eshel and others from North America and Israel, had a look at production of greenhouse gases along with land, irrigation, water, various other things related to meat, eggs and dairy production. And in fact, their headline take-home message was that beef consumption is the guilty party. Beef consumption has a much higher environmental cost than any of these other things, and that by minimizing beef consumption, we could mitigate the environmental cost of diet most effectively. Now, this, as I say, has been much talked about, but it is worth bearing in mind that the primary driver of the findings in this report is the situation in the United States, and as we heard earlier today, that's dominated by the feedlot system. Having said that, it's interesting to note that at least in Canada, where I have the privilege of working with a leading livestock economist, Professor Ellen Goddard, they've shown that, in fact, in their system, where they also have feedlots, only 9% of greenhouse gas emissions from the system come from the feedlots themselves, and in fact, 79% of emissions come from the cow-calf system, where the cow-calves and calves are primarily kept on rangeland. So there's a bit of a sobering thought there. I think that cuts both ways, because you could argue, well, the feedlot part of it is actually the more efficient part of the system, But also you might turn around and say, well, if you don't like the feedlot system, the argument that actually that's the most effective way of keeping animals is perhaps a little bit undermined by the fact that it's a relatively unimportant part of the whole system. So greenhouse gases, very, very important, but I think it's important also to stress the idea of planetary boundaries and some of the threats that we are facing, some of the threats we are creating for ourselves as a species on our one and only planet. And Rockstrom and others in 2009 put forward this idea of planetary boundaries. And in fact, as you can see from this figure, it's a well-touted figure in sort of environmental circles these days. Climate change is actually only one of the things of concern. And in terms of this particular report, climate change is not necessarily the thing of greatest immediate concern. That honour falls to biodiversity loss and also to a similar extent the nitrogen cycle. So this is a multidimensional problem, and there are other things in here as well, like ocean acidification and chemical pollution and various other things. So really this focus purely on greenhouse gases, which has grabbed a lot of the headlines, is a little bit misleading. And certainly we need to think this in terms of in relation to ecosystems. So the idea of tipping points or catastrophic shifts in ecosystems has been around for quite some time, but it was very elegantly described in a publication in Nature by Scheffer and others in 2001, where they basically demonstrated that a system can exist in a number of stable states. And so in this figure here, you'll see that the vertical axis represents the state of the ecosystem or the well-being of the ecosystem, and this axis represents, in some theoretical way, the sort of conditions. So as conditions change, you get this relatively monotonous decrease in the state of well-being of the ecosystem, but you can get a sudden jump from this point here to a different state. And they explain this in terms of the stability of the state under various conditions. There isn't really time to go into this and describe in great detail, but you can liken it, if you like, to a ball on a surface which comes to rest in a depression. If you move that ball a bit, well, it will just roll back into the depression. But as the landscape changes, as the curve changes, you reach a point where there's actually just a very small jump it has to make to flip into a new state, or eventually you may reach a point where it just does that anyway. So this was established as a very important sort of ecological theory about the stability of ecosystems and their instability. And more recently, this theory has been used to look at what's happening in terms of the planetary land use. So in this figure, essentially, the green area, the light green area represents the fraction of the Earth's lands that has dynamics that have been the sort of characteristic essentially of the last 11,000 years, so basically things as they are without man's interference. And the darker green, increasing slices of the cake represent significant changes in land use caused by human activity, particularly farming. And the suggestion is that we are reaching a point in the present century where we're going to undergo potentially one of these catastrophic shifts predicted in the previous theory. So I think people have this awareness of state shifts and tipping points, and I think this is a very important driver of thinking in this area. In terms of biodiversity, it's quite sobering. Many of you may have seen this figure before, if so, apologies, but essentially I find that when I show this figure, many people are surprised, if not startled, to learn that wild animals represent only 3% of the global terrestrial vertebrate biomass. So basically, land animals. So you might be forgiven to think for thinking it was rather more based on the number of wildlife documentaries that are available on television and through David Attenborough, etc. But in fact, it's a trivial proportion of living land animals on Earth. Basically, it's 2/3 livestock, 1/3 humans, and a smidge of wildlife. So biodiversity is definitely a major concern. The water security issue. Anybody who's just attended the lunchtime session of the Sustainable Food Trust will have heard about the European nitrogen assessment and the societal costs of nitrates. It's recognized that something like 50% of all the nitrogen, which is an essential part of the amino acids that make up human bodies, was fixed by the Haber-Bosch process. The impact of agriculture on nitrogen is enormous, and was, as mentioned in the previous session. The costs to society of providing clean drinking water because of the need for treatment facilities in Europe is huge, and you can see in this figure, kindly given to me my colleague, an expert in this particular field at the University of Bristol, Penny Jones, shows the concentrations in particularly Northern Europe and the UK. Of course, the European Water Framework Directive was intended to address this problem, and it should have kicked in this year, but my understanding is that it has now been sort of kicked into the long grass and postponed for some time to come. So the interests of big business prevail once again. Some of the visible impacts of coastal nutrient pollution, so particularly nitrate, but also phosphate pollution, can be seen in another slide that Penny Jones kindly gave me to use. Around the world, numerous highly visible problems in coastal areas associated with this type of pollution. So we are dealing with a multifaceted problem. And I think it's interesting by comparison, when you think about the emphasis placed on greenhouse gas, to consider the situation with diesel cars. So in the UK, like most of Europe, the majority of new cars sold are now diesel, and essentially that has been as a result of incentives provided by the government because of their greater fuel efficiency. They were thought to be preferable from an environmental point of view, but certainly in the last year there's been an increasing amount of information coming out about their deleterious effects on human health because of particulate carbon, particularly in urban areas, which is, after all, where most human beings live nowadays. So looking at just a single dimension of a problem is often fraught with difficulty and may not lead to the right answers. Moving on to another aspect of this overall background situation is the question of whether it is better to farm in an integrated way with the landscape so that biodiversity and farming coexist as depicted here in this sort of somewhat naive situation, or whether the land-sparing approach, where you segregate agricultural production, perhaps in buildings, from the areas where you maintain biodiversity, is something that it often polarizes people. I think this idea was started, possibly, certainly strongly promoted by Andrew Balmford and his group in Cambridge, who are generally very much in favor, as many people are, of this land-sparing idea, that actually it's more efficient to do your polluting activities in one place, under one roof, if you like, where you can control them carefully, and then your ecosystem services and biodiversity is provided elsewhere. I personally have a few issues with that latter idea because I believe that the land sharing approach is intrinsically more robust. I think it engages the people who are involved in agricultural production with the whole business of conserving biodiversity, and I think it provides a better environment for human and animals to live in, but I won't go into the details of that. But it is interesting to note that there is some progress on scientific understanding of these issues, and some work done at the University of Edinburgh recently has come up with these so-called agent-based models, which I haven't got time to describe in detail, but essentially the idea is that you have two kind of agents in these models that represent people. They're either conservationists or they're farmers, and the farmers come in 3 degrees of sort of intensivity, if you like, that are represented here by 3 different colors. So the most intensive high farmer here, mid farmer here, low farmer here, and this the conservationist. And in this relatively simple model, it's actually quite complex from one point of view, but relatively simple in terms of how it describes the real world. There are 2 types of capital. There's financial capital, which is what the farmers are interested in, and there's natural capital, what the conservationists are interested in. So this is the shape of the landscape, and the financial capital is basically concentrated in these concentric circles radiating from the top right-hand corner, and the natural capital likewise radiating out from the bottom right-hand corner. And so under a simple scenario, the landscape, when you run the model, partitions itself so that the conservationists have this chunk, and then the 3 different gradations of intensivity of the farmers. So the low intensive farmers have some sort of empathy with the conservationists, if you like, occupy 3 areas of the landscape. You run the model and it decides where they're going to go of its own accord. In this instance, the demand for food is equally spread across the whole landscape. If you partition the landscape into 4 quadrants, essentially that no longer exchange food amongst themselves, something rather different happens. So you end up with these 4 different regions, 1, 2, 3, 4, maintaining the idea on the top left-hand figure that the availability of financial and natural capital are different across the landscape, and that remains the same. So you end up with some regions that fall short of being able to produce enough food, so regions 1 and regions 3. Region 4 produces too much, region 2 just about breaks even, and you can see that the distribution is very different, in fact. In the region 1, which is the one that significantly falls short, you end up with primarily agriculture. In the other regions, you get this blended landscape, so you get much more of a sort of land-sharing picture. And indeed, in the area that overproduces, the model allows for areas of land, these individual cells or pixels, to be unmanaged. So it almost achieves in itself a kind of set-aside situation. So I think it's interesting that in this kind of very emotive land-sharing, land-sparing debate, we are beginning to see sort of quite simple and elegant sort of mathematical treatments of this that allow us to understand better the processes that are taking place. I'm sure many people here will be familiar with the concept of sustainable intensification, which is certainly being promoted by our government and others around the world as the way forward for agricultural production in the face of the kind of challenges that I've been talking about. So this has been defined by the Royal Society Reaping the Benefit report as a process in which yields are increased without adverse environmental impact and without the cultivation of more land. There's also a report by the RISE organization, the European organization that was referred to earlier, where they talk about simultaneously improving the productivity and the environmental management of agricultural land. So if you like, you could think of it in terms of it's not just about maximizing yield per acre, it's about improving both yield and ecosystem services per hectare. Now, a lot of people struggle with this concept, and I'm afraid I'm one of them. I think it's, in as far as it goes, not a bad thing compared to doing nothing, but I would prefer to see some kind of intensive sustainability rather than sustainable intensification. I think too much is done in the name of feeding the future, dealing with the increasing number of people who are going to be around on this planet in the future, in countries where actually there isn't that much of a population increase predicted currently. And I do appreciate that we live in a world of global markets, but I think that actually we would be better to focus on increasing our sustainability, even if it means, for the time being, possibly reducing production a little bit, rather than just using this as a reason for a sort of gung-ho attempt to increase productivity, which I think actually, to my mind, equates to an attempt to increase profitability while at the same time ticking the sustainability box. We at the University of Bristol, along with a great many other academic institutions across the Food Security and Land Research Alliance and elsewhere in the UK, are involved in a research program funded by DEFRA and the UK Research Councils and the Levy Boards on sustainable intensification, a research platform. This is really only in its infancy, so I can't tell you very much about what it's delivered, but I can say that this is going to operate at 3 different levels. It's going to look at farm scale issues, it's going to look at landscape scale issues, which are obviously very important in terms of the things I've just been describing, and also in terms of economic issues such as markets, drivers, and interactions across the food chain. So I think this type of sustainable intensification research is going to be very much an emphasis on what people in the academic community are going to be doing into the future. Together with a number of colleagues from the University of Bristol, from the Food Security and Land Research Alliance, across the globe, in fact, last year we were fortunate that the prestigious scientific journal Nature agreed to publish a commentary article that we wrote entitled Steps to Sustainable Livestock, where we tried to highlight some of the key issues that we think relate to livestock, and particularly the keeping of ruminant livestock into the future as we travel through the present century. And essentially, I won't go through this blow by blow. I'm very happy to send a copy of this to anybody who's interested to read it for themselves. But just the sort of headline ingredients of this were the fact that animals consume a very large proportion of food that potentially edible by humans, particularly ruminant animals, and we feel that that should be reduced, and I think that should resonate with people in the Pasture-Based Livestock Association, that people should raise and keep regionally appropriate animals. I've worked for many, many years in tropical countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and very many people there attempt to replace indigenous livestock with European livestock, which I believe is really rather inappropriate. More of that later. But indeed, I think here we have seen a bit of a backlash against the Holstein Friesian, and again, more of that later. As a vet and somebody interested in not only animal diseases, but diseases transmitted from animals to human beings, I can't emphasize enough the importance of keeping animals healthy, not just for productivity, but also from the point of view of animal welfare and human health. Smart supplementation. Very often it may be micronutrients that are limiting productivity rather than the availability of energy and protein. And actually, if we can identify what these limitations are and address them, it can make livestock keeping much more efficient. We should change the emphasis from eating not large quantities of livestock produce, but better quality livestock produce. There is an enormous range in the amount of meat consumed across the planet. So in North America, for example, the United States, I think people on average consume a staggering 120 kilos of meat per person per year. In India, it's something like 3 kilos. And we are somewhere in the sort of upper echelons, although fortunately nowhere near that of the United States of America population. Livestock keeping practices needed to be tailored to and sensitive to local cultural demands and conditions. And it's very, very important that in livestock keeping, people have the opportunity to study best practice and to improve the way they keep their livestock, and for us to promote means for people to be able to do that. So I'm now going to go on and talk a little bit about some of the particular areas in which I think we have concerns. So this rather wonderful image was the poster for a conference about industrialization of agriculture in France last year. So I think this image sort of captures a lot of the perception about industrialized agriculture. And I think we are in a situation where we're kind of at a crossroads with this. The question of milk is central to a lot of the discussion today. And maybe not all of you are familiar with the UK Waste and Resources Action Programme, or WRAP, which actually audits the amount of food stuff that's thrown away in the UK. But their most recent report in 2013 highlighted that some 4.2 million tonnes of food are wasted in the UK every year, and milk actually ranks at third amongst foodstuffs that are thrown away. We have almost 500 million tonnes of avoidable dairy and egg waste in the UK in 2012. Don't let anybody tell you that a lot of this waste is inevitable. This isn't all the waste. This is what they consider to be avoidable waste. This is at a cost of over £750 million. The consumer nowadays, to my mind, regards milk as a throwaway commodity. As we've heard, it's priced at a ridiculously low price compared to, for example, water. Water is regarded as pretty much a throwaway commodity in our society. And why is this? Well, I sometimes say something when I show these slides. This is our food system. These are the businesses that are involved. I don't think I really need to say anything to this audience. I think you know what the point I'm making is. So here we are. This is a photograph I took last year, or some photographs in Morrison's. Actually, I had to update this now. So, you know, we are down to probably 22 pence per litre for a pint of milk. I find it amazing that we actually have any dairy industry left in this country at all. So it's hardly surprising that we have farmers who are trying to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and we have questions about mega dairies, for example, or the business about the Nocton mega dairy, which I think was quite interesting despite all the protests. The reason it didn't go ahead was actually due to the Environment Agency and the issues around sort of local pollution and management. But it's perhaps worth considering the pros and cons of these very large dairy enterprises. I think that there are interesting things to be considered on both sides. The people in favour of these large enterprises point out there's opportunity for better stockmanship because an enterprise of this size can actually afford to have more labour and therefore more people around looking after the animals, which is arguably better for their welfare, arguably better for their health. They're fed on very scientifically formulated total mixed ration, which is actually the best way of feeding cows. The efficiency of production arguably means that you get a litre of milk or less greenhouse gas production per litre of milk produced, and there are opportunities for things like anaerobic biodigestion, which are seen as very beneficial and green things. So I don't think it's all bad. I don't think it's all good either, because there are still issues. I mean, one of the issues in relation to animal welfare is about the ability of animals to express natural behavior, and arguably that isn't possible in animals that live their entire lives indoors. There are also questions of endemic infectious diseases. Everybody here, I'm sure, is familiar with the idea of biosecurity. Well, if you took this notion to the extreme and we had all our dairy cattle in just one vast dairy herd, there would be no, effectively, any biosecurity between these animals. By having it in smaller biosecure units, arguably we're better able to contain the important infectious diseases of livestock, which are a very serious economic consideration. Total mixed ration, well, it's not grass, is it? And what are the ingredients? Where does it come from? Where is the environmental footprint of that? And then lastly, as I mentioned, environmental concerns. So I'm not really sort of wedded to the idea of this being a good thing or it being a bad thing, but I think there are important issues both ways, and I think we need to consider the full picture very carefully. So total mixed ration, well, from a nutritional point of view, might be very beneficial. I'm certainly concerned about the impact it's had in South America in terms of a large proportion of protein coming from soy. This figure on the left shows the growth in soy production over the last 25 years, and you can see the big purple slice there is what's happened in Brazil. The bits of Brazil that aren't actually tropical rainforest, the wooded savanna area is known as the Cerrado, and about 50% of that has now been cleared for agriculture. And as in Argentina and other Latin American, South American countries, there are major environmental problems associated with this. So getting the ingredients for the total mixed ration, all we're doing, arguably, is exporting a big part of the environmental problem. This is the last audience I need to talk to about the benefits of pasture. We've seen images like this already today, mixed swards with nitrogen-fixing legumes, also very beneficial for pollinating insects, in contrast to, say, monocultures like rape, which provide plenty of pollen for a very short period of the year. Well-managed swards can provide these pollinating insects, which are a key part of our biodiversity throughout, essentially, the season. And I think it's important for people to realize that things like pollinating insects and biodiversity are not simply a sort of a nicety, some sort of interesting thing that allows our children to do biology projects, and that may be nice to see when we go on picnics. I think biodiversity is a fundamental part of life on Earth, and without it we actually run considerable risks, not least of which that our large monoculture crops are highly susceptible to a number of pests and pathogens. And my colleague within the Food Security and Land Research Alliance at the University of Exeter, formerly of the University of Oxford, but Professor Sarah Gurr, one of the world's leading experts on fungal diseases, points out that if we were unfortunate enough to have a major outbreak of a fungal disease of several of the world's staple crops at the same time, generally we tend to find that there's sort of one or another going on at any given time, we could, as a species, be in serious trouble. And biodiversity is obviously the sort of converse of monoculture. So I come on to one of my favorite subjects, the beloved Holston Holstein Cow. I think this is one of the great marvels of farming, of veterinary science, of genetics, of animal breeding. So there have been these extreme market forces that have reshaped the dairy industry, as we heard this morning. It's become incredibly efficient with these smaller, larger herds of hundreds of animals with minimized labor costs, so that's the fixed costs are sort of kept down by having these larger herds, and it's all, not all down, but a lot of it's down to the availability of these hugely high-yielding Holstein cattle with their 10,000 litre yields, these wonderful animals. And I think these are some of the things that, as a veterinary surgeon, I find are particularly superb about them. They provide us with all this work: infertility, lameness, mastitis, metabolic disease, digestive disorders, infectious disease, routine antibiotic and hormone treatments. So virtually every dairy farm has a routine herd health visit from a vet who comes to look at the reproductive status of cattle postpartum, giving the various hormone treatments required for retained corpora lutea and non-cyclicity, etc., retained placenta, endometritis, and this gets the vets onto the farm, and while they're there, they can provide us other services, etc. So I shouldn't really complain about this, but arguably, rather than the perfect cow, you could consider this animal to be a perfect storm, this prodigious yield requiring huge amounts of energy and protein beyond the levels available from pasture. It consumes valuable potential human food, probably more than its own body weight of cereals in a lactation. It's very ill-equipped to digest a grain-rich diet, so things like subacute ruminal acidosis, liver abscessation, ketoacidosis, left displaced or displaced abomasum. When I was a veterinary student, 30 years ago, scary to think, a displaced abomasum was a relatively unusual condition. They happen, but if as a student you got to see one, you were quite lucky. Our students come back from their extramural studies, as we call the period that they go and spend time in veterinary practices, and you ask them, put your hand up if you've seen one of these conditions, and they all put both hands up and say, I saw 6 in a week. These things are just every day. Cereals produced using artificial fertilizer, which is highly polluting, as we know. And moreover, I think one of the great advantages of ruminant livestock, one of the reasons why we perhaps want to domesticate these animals, is their ability to digest forage and green waste and byproducts that is of no or low nutritional value to monogastric species such as pigs, poultry, or indeed human beings. So we have this kind of dairy dilemma. Now, I don't have any particular, well, I'm quite fond of the Ayrshire breed, but I don't have a particular sort of hobby horse to ride about Ayrshires. It was just actually a convenient image I got. So, you know, we may have a Holstein giving something like 10,000 litres of milk in a lactation, and an Ayrshire which could give getting on for 80% of that, but living in two entirely different systems, entirely different worlds, leaving aside perhaps the greenhouse gas for one moment, and I think there are a lot of issues there that we don't fully understand. You could argue that potentially with the Ayrshire type animal or the lower producing animal, we're getting in the region of 80% of the yield for something like 20% of the pollution costs if we consider things like inorganic fertilizer. To get that extra 20% more yield in the Holstein, we need to actually put in 80% more inputs. So there's a commonly recognized economic principle here, the Pareto Principle or 80-20 rule, that says that actually in many human endeavors, you get 80% of the return by putting in 20% of the input. And to get the remaining 20% of the return, to take you up to 100%, you have to put in another 80% of the input. So it doesn't take many prizes to guess which is the best option. So are we in that kind of a situation here? Well, there is a much quoted publication by Judith Kappa and colleagues who compared dairy production in 1944 compared with 2007, and this has actually been used as a rebuttal of my arguments. So they say in their conclusion that modern dairy systems producing just 24% of the manure, less than half of the methane, and nearly just over half of the nitrous oxide per kilo of milk compared the equivalent in historical dairying. So obviously, I'll get my coat, I'll shut up, I'm completely wrong about all of this. But it's interesting actually to look at the small print because you see they're comparing animals in the 1944 system where you've got about 2,000 kilos or litres of milk per lactation with a figure of around 9,000 they've used for Holsteins in 2007. And I suspect that there are many people here who can say that they have dairy cattle that are raised non-intensively and that they're using primarily pasture to produce milk who are getting yields significantly better than that. So I think the jury is still out on this, but I believe that there are many arguments in favor of slightly less intensive production, that essentially by reducing yield a little bit, we could have huge gains in terms of sustainability. This was just drawn to my attention yesterday, actually, by some of our cattle health residents at the veterinary school in Langford, in Bristol, a paper by the Danish group who compared 3 different types of herds or herd composition, Holstein Friesian type animals, Jersey animals, and mixed breeding herds, kept to all intents and purposes under actually very, very similar conditions. So it wasn't the management of the animals, it was just the genetics. And they found, as one of their sort of headline conclusions, if you like, that Holstein cows have higher production in intake but lower efficiency than the Jersey when compared at the average production level of the commercial herds. I said I'd mention this again. Huge numbers of Holstein cattle have been imported into Africa and Asia. I think that's a mistake. They're not suited. They have to often be kept in pens and the fodder cut and carried to them because of parasites and diseases. They're not used to heat and humidity. Time won't permit me to go into that in any more detail. But just to say, what are we actually doing apart from just wringing our hands about these challenges? Well, together with people from a wide group of universities, who together with Bristol form something called the Worldwide Universities Network, and with support from that network and also the US and the UK governments under something called the Global Innovation Initiative, and indeed a little bit of support from our own Cabot Institute, we have created a network, a grouping called the Global Farm Platform. You can see its global distribution here. I'm going to go over time if I go into too much detail, but the countries are spread across all the major continents. United States represented with several sites, Australia, Canada, UK, Africa, India, China, and in fact the ones highlighted in blue have already agreed that they have a particular farm location that they are going to agree to become part of this alliance of sort of model research farms, if you like, that have the dual functions of both trying to discover and work out what is best practice, but also pass on this knowledge to local farmers. So we have the Northwick Farm Platform in Devon, which has a focus on hydrological isolation of fields and looking at nutrient flow through a pasture-based beef production system. We have collaborators with a site in Uruguay, which is a very interesting location. They have a very large cattle population, 12 million cattle, just 3 million people, all extensively reared with minimal concentrate feeding or grain feeding, so it's a sort of antithesis of the feedlot system. And I think I put this photograph in here because I wasn't quite sure where it belongs, but I liked it because it's grass-fed economy beef. Actually took this photograph in Australia, but it was to remind me that this is very unscientific, but the first two people I asked when I came back from Uruguay about what would you say if you were going to buy some beef or some lamb in your local supermarket and you saw it came from Uruguay, what would your thoughts be? Two close family members, actually. One of them, highly educated people as well, should have perhaps known better. One of them said to me, well, I would be worried about the destruction of the rainforest. I thought, well, you perhaps better go and look at your atlas or Google Maps because you're not in quite the right place. And the other one said, well, yes, it's all very well, but all of that transport cost, bringing it here, no, it's much better to have sort of local. Well, actually, if you do the sums, if things are transported in modern refrigerated shipping, the transport costs are a really trivial part of the environmental footprint. And nevertheless, I think, it was a tiny sample, completely unscientific, but I think that a lot of people might think similarly. And so the marketing of this type of product is a major challenge. Another partner is the Future Farm in Australia, where they produce sheep and crops as well as kangaroos. So there's biodiversity, and everything that is done there, they do it in a way that they believe would be best practice, not just now, but in 2050. We have a partner in India in a place called Thiruvazhamkunu. It took me a long time to learn how to say that. I've been practicing, otherwise known as Silent Valley, where they have very interesting indigenous livestock. For example, the Vakure cattle, the world's smallest breed, that produce just 5 to 6 pints of milk a day, but maybe it's a much more appropriate animal for landless farmers there than a whopping great big Holstein Friesian animal that's been exported by a well-meaning farmer in the UK. And things like the cultivation of an aquatic plant, the water fern, azolla, which is done in large quantities that's then dried and provides a protein source for animals. So you can read more about this. I'm out of time now. But the Global Farm Platform has its own website. It's just globalfarmplatform.org, www, and go and have a look at that for yourselves. And I think I'll have to leave it there, so it just remains to acknowledge the very many people who have helped with what I presented you today in the creation of the Global Farm Platform, particularly Michael Lee at the University of Bristol, who I think I can let you know now has recently been appointed to a professorial level joint appointment between the University of Bristol and the Northwick Farm Platform, so one of the Global Farm Platform sites. He's now the head of, or about to take up the reins as the head of site there, and also Jennifer Dungate of Rothamsted Research in Northwick, and many people across all the institutions involved. And of course, I must acknowledge our funders, particularly the BBSRC and the Levy Boards and the Cabot Institute and the UK, US governments and the Worldwide Universities Network. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got a few minutes over time, but we've got 7 minutes until 2:30, so if there's any questions from the floor, put your hand up please, and stand up and tell us who you are. The gentleman over there, glasses and a beard.
Simon Fairley. Methane, you didn't mention much about methane and the methane calculations in Livestock's Long Shadow. My feeling is that they don't look at all the opportunity costs of what would happen if you got rid of the livestock, what might occur in the form of wetlands and forest farms and termites and bison and heaven knows what. I also think they didn't look at the opportunity costs of nitrogen. Similarly, do you have any views on that?
Well, I would have to agree with you, I'm afraid. It does make a very interesting discussion. It would be better if I could disagree. But no, I think you're absolutely right. I think our understanding of these very complex interactions is limited. And I think there is much to learn. But I think when you're writing a report and you want to produce a headline figure, it's very easy to sort of, you may collect a whole lot of very sort of objective scientific information, but there are ways in which you can sort of put it together and package it and decide what you're going to include, not include, to make your point as strongly as you can. And I think our understanding of these things is in its infancy. And in fact, one of the things that the Northwick Farm platform should give an opportunity to do is actually give direct comparisons of really quite sort of similar things, but whereby relatively few parameters are changed from one system to another, because they have the whole site separated into 3 completely independently run farmlets where the livestock are actually not only grazed completely separately, but they're now housed in the winter separately under different management systems. And I think it's experimental work like that that's going to give us a sort of, the next tier of understanding in these things. I think Long Shadow was a useful report. I think it put the whole thing on the political agenda, but the knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, farming animals is bad, we must all become vegetarians, is not the right one. And I think that actually, as in all things, sort of sense and compromise will be necessary, and a better understanding of these fluxes is required. And the more you look into it, like so many things, the more complicated it is.
Well done. There's 2 questions on there. Sorry, David first and then Neil.
Dave Stanley. I think we're all very pleased with the presentation in certain respects there. In particular, in fact, I think there's an overly too much focus on single-issue environmentalism, and climate change is a classic example of that. I'm very pleased that you put up that planetary boundary and included, for instance, acidification on it. But in this focus or tendency to focus on climate change, the easy hit on this is farmers, because they're a diverse group of people. They've apparently got this whopping number on the methane side there. So from the governments generally, cattle is a good, easy hit. Much easier than taking on the oil companies and the fertilizer producers and all the rest of it. But in terms of greenhouse gases generally, I think the whole approach needs to be questioned in terms of looking at the emissions, the pollution end. And I think a good comparison is trying to manage human health by analysing and controlling what comes out of a sewage pipe. By tackling greenhouse gases there, a number that are included, methane and nitrous oxides, naturally occur in the environment, and they're added into the equation, which gives a huge distorting factor. And I think that's something that ought to be carried back to IPCC and tackled. But the final point is, from the pasture side, I think you managed to get through the whole chat there, very good as it was, without mentioning the word soil. And in terms of soil, as you're probably aware, it holds 600 gigatons of carbon in the Earth's grasslands. There's 6 gigatons emitted from fossil fuels. So a mere 1% increase in carbon in grasslands globally arguably offsets the emissions from carbon, if that's from fossil fuels, if that's the only problems that we're tackling.
Yes, I mean, I don't think there's any specific question there, but just on your last point, my apologies for not mentioning soils. I have for most of my life obviously been somebody who deals with things above ground, but I am increasingly aware of the importance of soils, and indeed one of the people I specifically acknowledged at Northwick, Jenny Dungate, is a soil scientist, and since I have been working with her on this for the last few years, I've been educated in this by her and others, and I agree of the great importance of this. And one of the things that the Northwick Farm platform enables is sort of integration of understanding of what happens throughout the production cycle, including what's going on underground. And I have great hopes for the outputs of this research.
Okay, Neil.
Mark, how do you do? I'm Neil Darwent, and I'm pleased to meet you at last, and very interested in your presentation. I am going to ask you a question, but I first of all want to welcome you to the hit list of the Holstein Society. You've now joined me on. And As an advocate of a slightly different approach to dairy farming and my belief in robust dual-purpose dairy breeds, I've been privileged to be able to work a little bit with Michael Lee and Robert Orr down at Northwick. And through this conference, I'm just constantly picking up the value of academic work that's going on surrounding the future of food and farming. And I just want to know if you've got any ideas how we can increase the flow of information from research to farmers and the kind of thing you're talking about in making sure we get an alternative vision across to farmers, because you talked there about the Holstein cow, and I share your cynicism. We as farmers have been sold a system by the commercial organizations for so long. But my question is there any way you can think of that we can begin to create better engagement between farmers and researchers like yourself?
Well, I think you've just done it, really, by asking the question, but I would also say that I couldn't agree with you more. The Global Farm Platform, actually, one of the things that the academic community that's come together to form this have done is essentially draw up a document which is not anything as strong as a kind of memorandum of understanding, because you know, that would require in the university the lawyers to go away and look at it for a year, and then they'd shake their heads and say, oh, you can't sign this because of this, that, and the other. It's just a fairly sort of light touch document that basically encapsulates this philosophy of what we believe in terms of our approach to this. But one of the sort of headlines within it is that it's essential that farmers are on board from the beginning, and we are currently in the process of looking to sort of recruit farmers to be more closely involved as this thing begins to kind of come of age. Apart from that, we are increasingly getting the message from our funders, for example, the European Union Horizon 2020 program, where they would like us to include farmers in some of the work that we're doing there in relation to sustainability of livestock. And we're currently putting together a bid for one of their programs that will require us to do that. And if the bid is successful, then that'll be an opportunity to do it. Because we obviously, you know, we need a mechanism to do it. We need a vehicle to do it. I think the fact that I was invited here to come and speak to people today perhaps is an example of doing it. And the fact that I felt it was a worthy cause and that I would set aside today to do so is an example of that. So I think essentially we have to keep up the pressure, we have to keep reminding each other, we have to keep up the dialogue. The Northwick Farm Platform, for example, is supposed to have a body of farmers as part of its sort of guiding principle, part of its governance. The extent to which that actually is effective has perhaps been suboptimal. They've had a few managemental challenges over the last couple of years, but I think with Michael Lee's appointment as head of that body, we will see some change there. There will be more engagement with the farming community, because I think, you know, without that, it's not going anywhere. So yes, and let's keep up the dialogue. And so I'm open to approaches from anybody with any sector of the farming community. I think as academics we have to be open-minded. I don't think we should be seen to be sort of wedded to one particular school of thought or another. I think we should just basically be in the business of collecting evidence and weighing up the evidence, and then on the basis of that sort of deciding what the best way forward is. But I'm very happy to speak to anybody from sort of any side of any divide in the farming community, or any end of the spectrum, or the middle.
Time's limited. We've got two more questions. Chris, is that a quick one?
Chris Jones, I'm a livestock farmer from Cornwall. The relative amounts of human domestic stock and wild biomass is very interesting. Ruminants get a really bad rap. But is it not true that, let's say, in prehistory, arguably 8,000 years ago, how many billion tons of ruminant livestock was running around the planet and not causing global warming?
Well, indeed. I mean, in many places, a lot of wild animals are ruminants, and you've only got to go to the sort of game parks of East Africa to witness that. You know, having said that, a lot of termites contribute a lot to terrestrial biomass too, and a lot to CO2 production. So I think the problem is not entirely ruminants, it's not entirely domestic livestock. It's more complex than that. But I think that I find that slide is worth showing, because I think many people are surprised by that. Perhaps people in the farming community less so, certainly in other audiences. And I think there is an important message there that, if nothing else, to emphasize how much of what goes on in the planetary ecosystems is within the control of mankind. I mean, if I think of my own father, who's now, I think, 86, 87 next year, so somebody born in the late 1920s, in his mindset, the world's resources are still infinite. You could throw anything in the sea, its capacity to absorb it is vastly dwarfs anything man could do. This is, in his mentality, all of this is unnecessary, because the planet will sort itself out. And I think the wake-up call is actually, we've got to the point where there are just sufficient human beings that actually most of what happens, at least on the land surface of the world, is hugely influenced by human activity, and indeed probably everywhere else as well, but particularly and visibly on the land.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah. Just as John Brennan, I'm an organic farmer. I'm a livestock farmer in Ireland, and I farm rare breeds. But one gentleman over here talked about often it's only when you get to a forum like this where academics and farmers can actually have these conversations. I'm actually a member of Group de Bruges, not to be confused with the Bruges Group, which is something completely different, in Europe, where we have these type of discussions. And one of the things that came to mind when you were talking about sustainable intensification, sustainable intensification, was looking at the words ecological intensification. That to me seems to make an awful lot more sense, because the word sustainable has become so abused. So I just wonder if you'd have a comment on that. And secondly, just in terms of genetic diversity, the role that rare breeds could play to try and obviate some of the issues we've seen here with the Holsteins. Thank you.
Yeah, so two questions there, really. Yes, I mean, I agree with you. I think the phrase sustainable intensification is in danger of becoming a cliche if it isn't already. And I think it's also means different things to different people, and I think it does create an opportunity in some quarters for sort of a box-ticking exercise, i.e. we will continue to pursue our business goals of making as much profit as possible. But if we can say that we're doing something that may have some environmental benefit that we wouldn't otherwise have done, we can then tick the sustainable intensification box. Whereas in fact, that tick is making, in practical terms, virtually no difference to our trajectory towards planetary boundaries. And that's why I struggle with the phrase, and I think sort of alternative formulations are actually useful, if for no other reason because they get people to think a little bit more widely. Your second question about rare breeds, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's very, very important that we maintain the genetic diversity of livestock, and as many different types of animals, plants, etc. as we can, because we don't know what we may wish to have in the future. I think our cattle, for example, type of cattle we have currently, mainly in Europe, some of the pressures that have driven us towards those, leaving milk aside, cattle for production of beef, the sort of obsession with low saturated fat diets, don't even get me started on that. So, we have these breeds of animals which are almost devoid of any fat, and to my mind are almost inedible. And, very rapidly maturing breeds, perhaps to some extent because of BSE and over 30 months scheme. And in fact, other breeds may be much more suited to the kind of activities that people who believe in the values of the Pasture-Based Livestock Association, and having that genetic diversity to draw upon to actually create the right kind of breeds is useful. Another area that I'm involved in is, I've pointed out, albeit at some speed, the drawbacks of Holsteins in the tropics. What are the ideal dairy cattle for the tropics? I think people are beginning to realize that there may be an opportunity to create some sort of genetically stabilized breed of livestock that will combine features of higher yields than some of the indigenous breeds, but some of the robustness in the face of heat, stress, and disease and parasitic challenge and nutritional challenge, etc., that those breeds have. What the mix is that's going to get us there, we don't necessarily know, but having that diversity available to draw upon to get there can only be a good thing.
Okay, thank you very much for those short answers. Okay, has anybody got any questions you can ask Mark after this meeting? Okay, we've got half an hour break now, and on behalf of the audience and everybody else present, thank you very much for your presentation, Mark.